I pretended to be dying to see which family members would actually care. The results were devastating. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to test my family's love, but here we are. My whole life, I've been the one everyone calls when they need something: money, a favor, someone to listen to their problems. But when I needed support, crickets. So I decided to conduct a little experiment that would change everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me. It started 3 months ago when I was sitting in my apartment, staring at my phone after another family gathering where I felt completely invisible. My cousin had just gotten engaged and the whole family was fawning over her ring, taking pictures, planning parties. I sat there for 2 hours and maybe three people said hello to me. That's when the idea hit me like a truck. I spent weeks planning this whole thing out. I created fake medical documents using templates I found online, practiced looking pale and weak in the mirror, even bought some makeup to make myself look sicker. The story I came up with was that I had a rare blood disorder that was getting worse, and the doctors weren't sure how much time I had left. I know it sounds crazy, but I needed to know who actually cared about me. The first person I told was my older brother. We used to be close when we were kids, but as adults, he only called when he needed something. I sent him a long text message explaining my fake condition, how scared I was, and how I didn't want to burden the family but felt he should know. His response came 3 days later, just a simple "sorry man, that sucks. Let me know if you need anything." That was it. 3 days to process that his younger brother was supposedly dying, and all I got was a text that felt like he was responding to news about bad weather. I stared at that message for an hour, feeling something break inside my chest. This was the same brother who used to build forts with me, who taught me how to ride a bike, who promised he'd always have my back. Next was my sister. She's always been the family princess, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. When I called her crying, really selling the performance, she listened for about 5 minutes before cutting me off to tell me about her new promotion at work. She said she was sorry about my health, but seemed more interested in sharing her good news than dealing with my fake crisis. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes total. She promised to visit soon but never did. 2 weeks passed, and she posted pictures from a weekend trip to the mountains with her friends. Not once did she check in on her supposedly dying brother. I felt like I was looking at a stranger wearing my sister's face. My parents were the ones I was most nervous about telling. They're getting older and I worried about how they'd handle the news, even fake news. But I had to know where I stood with them too. When I sat them down in their living room, the same room where we used to watch movies together every Friday night, I delivered my rehearsed speech about the blood disorder. My mom started crying immediately, which made me feel terrible about the lie. But then something weird happened. After the initial shock wore off, they started talking about practical things: who would get my car, whether I had a will, if I'd thought about funeral arrangements. My dad actually pulled out a notebook and started making lists. They were planning my death before even asking what treatments were available. The whole conversation felt surreal. Here I was, sitting on the same couch where they used to read me bedtime stories, and they were discussing my funeral like it was a weekend barbecue they needed to organize. I kept waiting for them to ask about experimental treatments or second opinions, but they seemed to have already accepted my fate. Over the next few weeks, I watched my family's behavior carefully. My brother sent exactly two more texts, one asking if I'd made arrangements for my apartment lease, and another wondering if I still had his old baseball cards. My sister called once, but spent most of the conversation talking about her relationship problems with her boyfriend. My parents visited twice. The first time, they brought a casserole and spent an hour going through my belongings, suggesting what should be donated and what might be valuable. The second visit, they brought forms for me to sign, transferring various accounts and responsibilities to them. It felt like they were cleaning up a mess rather than spending time with their dying son. The most painful part was watching how they talked about me to other family members. I found out through my aunt that my mom had been telling everyone about my condition, but in the same breath, she'd mentioned how much work it was going to be to deal with my affairs. My dad apparently told his golf buddies that at least I didn't have kids or a wife to leave behind, so it wouldn't be too complicated. But then something unexpected happened. My uncle showed up at my door one evening, completely unannounced. He's always been the black sheep of the family, never married, traveled the world, worked odd jobs. Everyone always talked about him like he was irresponsible and unreliable. He stood there in my doorway with grocery bags and a sleeping bag. He didn't say much at first, just started unpacking food and making dinner. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was moving in to take care of me. No discussion, no conditions, just pure determination. He'd quit his job, given up his apartment, and decided to spend whatever time I had left making sure I wasn't alone. I almost broke down and confessed everything right then. Over the next 2 weeks, my uncle became my constant companion. He cooked meals, cleaned my apartment, drove me to fake doctor appointments, and sat with me during long evenings when I pretended to be in pain. He never once asked about my possessions or what would happen after I was gone. He just focused on making each day as comfortable as possible. The contrast was devastating. Here was the family member everyone dismissed as unreliable, and he was the only one who showed up when it mattered. Meanwhile, the people I'd always thought of as the responsible, caring ones were treating my death like a business transaction. It completely flipped my understanding of my own family. Things got even more complicated when my neighbor started getting involved. She's an elderly woman who lives alone and has always been friendly but never intrusive. When she heard about my condition through my uncle, she started bringing over homemade soup and offering to help with errands. She'd sit with me for hours, sharing stories about her late husband and asking about my life, really listening to my answers. This woman, who owed me nothing and barely knew me, was showing more compassion than my immediate family. She even started researching my fake condition online, printing out articles about new treatments and support groups. Her genuine concern made me feel even worse about the deception, but it also showed me what real care looked like. The breaking point came when my cousin announced she was moving up her wedding date. When I asked why, thinking maybe she wanted me to be there before my condition worsened, she explained that she didn't want a funeral to interfere with her wedding plans. She actually said it would be better if I could wrap things up before her big day so the family wouldn't be distracted by grief. I sat in my car outside her house for an hour after that conversation, crying harder than I had since I was a kid. This was a person I'd grown up with, someone I'd considered more like a sister than a cousin. We'd shared secrets, supported each other through breakups, celebrated each other's achievements. And now she was asking me to time my death around her wedding schedule. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my uncle and told him I needed to confess something important. We sat in my living room, the same room where he'd been taking care of me for weeks, and I told him the truth. I explained about feeling invisible, about wanting to test the family's love, about how his response had meant everything to me. I expected him to be angry, to feel betrayed and used. Instead, he was quiet for a long time, then started laughing. Not a cruel laugh, but something that sounded almost relieved. When I asked what was funny, he said he'd suspected something was off, but hadn't wanted to confront me about it. He'd noticed inconsistencies in my story and had even called one of the doctors I'd mentioned, only to find out they didn't exist. But here's the thing that completely blindsided me. He'd known it was fake and he'd still stayed. He'd still given up his life to take care of me, knowing that I was lying to him. When I asked why, he said that anyone desperate enough to fake a terminal illness clearly needed help, even if they couldn't ask for it directly. He'd decided to love me through whatever I was going through, real or imaginary. This revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. I'd been so focused on testing everyone else that I'd missed the most important lesson of all. My uncle had shown me unconditional love, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances or proof or even honesty. He'd seen through my deception and chosen to care anyway. We talked until sunrise that morning. He told me about his own struggles with feeling disconnected from the family, about how he'd always felt like an outsider looking in. He explained that's why he'd understood my desperate need for validation, because he'd felt it too. But he'd learned that real love isn't something you can test or prove. It's something you choose to give and receive regardless of the circumstances. The next few days were spent figuring out how to undo the damage I'd caused. My uncle helped me craft a message to send to the family, explaining that there had been a misdiagnosis and that I was actually fine. We decided to keep the truth about the deception between us, at least for now. I wasn't ready to deal with the fallout of admitting I'd lied about something so serious. The responses to my recovery were telling in their own way. My brother sent a thumbs-up emoji. My sister called to say she was happy I was okay, but then immediately started talking about her work stress again. My parents seemed more relieved about not having to deal with funeral arrangements than actually happy about my health. But my cousin's response was the most revealing. She called to say she was glad I was better, but then asked if I was absolutely sure about the diagnosis because she'd already told people about my condition and didn't want to look stupid. She was more concerned about her social embarrassment than my well-being. My neighbor brought over a celebration cake and cried happy tears when I told her the good news. She said she'd been praying for me every night and had even started a prayer chain at her church. Her joy was so genuine that I almost confessed the truth to her too, but I couldn't bring myself to disappoint someone who'd shown me such pure kindness. The weeks following my fake recovery were strange. I kept expecting to feel relief or closure, but instead I felt hollow. I'd gotten the answers I was looking for, but they weren't the answers I'd wanted. I now knew exactly where I stood with each family member, and the knowledge was devastating. I started pulling away from family gatherings, making excuses about work or other commitments. When I did show up, I felt like I was watching everything through glass present but not really there. I'd see my parents laughing with my cousins, my brother sharing stories with our extended family, my sister getting attention for her various achievements, and I'd feel like a ghost haunting my own life. The only bright spot was my relationship with my uncle. We'd grown closer through this experience, and he'd become someone I could truly count on. He never brought up the deception or made me feel guilty about it. Instead, he focused on moving forward and building something real between us. He started including me in his adventures, weekend trips to places he'd discovered, hiking trails he'd heard about, little restaurants he wanted to try. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had a true friend in my family. Someone who saw me for who I really was and chose to spend time with me anyway. But the guilt about lying to him, even though he'd known, continued to eat at me. I kept thinking about all the nights he'd slept on my couch, all the meals he'd cooked, all the comfort he'd provided for a crisis that didn't exist. He'd given up his entire life for weeks to care for me, and I felt like I didn't deserve that level of sacrifice. One evening, about 6 weeks after my confession, I brought this up to him. I told him how guilty I felt, how unworthy of his love and care. His response changed my entire perspective on the situation. He said that love isn't something you earn or deserve, it's something you give freely or you don't give at all. He'd chosen to love me, and that choice had nothing to do with whether I was actually dying or not. He also pointed out something I hadn't considered, that my willingness to go to such extreme lengths to feel loved showed how much I was hurting. He said that healthy, happy people don't fake terminal illnesses. They don't feel so invisible that they need to create emergencies to get attention. My deception wasn't just about testing others. It was a cry for help that I couldn't make any other way. This conversation was the first time I really understood that I'd been struggling with deep loneliness and depression for years. I'd been so focused on everyone else's behavior that I'd missed my own pain. The fake illness was just a symptom of a much bigger problem. I'd lost touch with who I was and what I needed. My uncle suggested that instead of continuing to focus on my family's shortcomings, I should focus on building the kind of relationships I actually wanted. He reminded me that I couldn't control how others loved me, but I could control how I loved myself and how I chose to spend my time and energy. This advice led to some major changes in my life. I started reaching out to old friends I'd lost touch with, people who'd known me before I became so wrapped up in family dynamics. I was surprised by how many of them were happy to hear from me and eager to reconnect. I'd been so focused on feeling unloved by my family that I'd forgotten about all the other relationships in my life. I also started pursuing interests I'd put on hold while trying to be the perfect son, brother, and cousin. I'd always wanted to learn photography, so I signed up for a class at the community college. I'd been interested in volunteering at the local animal shelter, so I started going there on weekends. These activities put me in contact with people who shared my interests and values. The photography class was especially meaningful. There was something therapeutic about capturing moments and seeing them through a different lens. I started taking pictures of everyday things: my uncle cooking dinner, my neighbor working in her garden, strangers walking their dogs in the park. Each photo reminded me that there was beauty and connection all around me, even when I felt isolated. At the animal shelter, I met people who were there purely because they wanted to help. They didn't know anything about my family drama or my fake illness. They just saw someone who was willing to show up and care for animals that needed attention. Being around that kind of selfless compassion started to heal something in me that I didn't even know was broken. Slowly, I began to understand that my family's response to my fake crisis wasn't necessarily about not loving me. It was about their own limitations and fears. My parents' focus on practical matters might have been their way of trying to maintain control in a situation that felt overwhelming. My siblings' distance might have been their way of protecting themselves from pain they couldn't handle. This realization didn't excuse their behavior, but it helped me see it in a different light. They weren't evil or heartless. They were just people dealing with their own stuff in the only ways they knew how. And while that wasn't enough for me, it also wasn't entirely their fault. We'd all grown up in the same family system that had taught us to prioritize certain things over others. The most difficult part of this whole experience was accepting that I might never have the kind of relationship with my family that I'd always wanted. I'd spent so much of my life hoping they'd change, waiting for them to see me differently, trying to earn their attention and affection. But people are who they are, and wanting them to be different doesn't make them different. This acceptance was both liberating and heartbreaking. On one hand, it freed me from the constant disappointment and frustration of unmet expectations. On the other hand, it meant grieving the family relationships I'd always dreamed of having. It meant accepting that some of my deepest needs for connection and belonging would have to be met elsewhere. My uncle became my guide through this process. He'd already learned these lessons the hard way, through his own years of feeling like an outsider in the family. He showed me that it was possible to love people while also protecting yourself from their limitations. He demonstrated how to maintain connections without sacrificing your own well-being. The final twist in this whole story happened about 3 months after my fake recovery. I was at a family barbecue trying to practice my new boundaries and emotional distance when my aunt pulled me aside. She's always been the family gossip, the one who knows everyone's business, so I figured she wanted to share some drama about one of my cousins. Instead, she told me something that completely changed my understanding of the situation. She said that after hearing about my illness, she'd been in contact with several family members about planning a surprise visit to see me. Apparently, my parents, siblings, and cousins had all been coordinating secretly to organize something special for me. The plan had been to show up at my apartment with a huge group of people, bringing my favorite foods and planning to spend the whole weekend with me. They'd been waiting for the right moment, trying to coordinate everyone's schedules and make sure they could all be there together. My aunt said they'd wanted it to be a surprise that would show me how much I meant to all of them. But then I'd announced my recovery and the plan had been scrapped. Everyone had been disappointed that they hadn't gotten the chance to show their love in the way they'd planned. My aunt said several family members had been crying when they heard the news, not just from relief, but from sadness that they'd missed their opportunity to be there for me. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. All this time, I'd been interpreting their seemingly casual responses as proof that they didn't care, when in reality they'd been planning something that would have been exactly what I needed. Their individual responses had seemed cold, because they were all part of a bigger plan that I'd unknowingly sabotaged with my fake recovery. I stood there in my aunt's backyard, surrounded by the sound of my family laughing and talking, feeling like my entire world had shifted. Everything I thought I knew about their love for me was wrong. They had cared. They had been planning to show up for me in a big way. I just ended the crisis before they could act on it. The guilt was overwhelming. Not only had I lied about being terminally ill, but I'd also completely misread their responses to that lie. I'd created a test that was designed to fail, and then I'd ended it before they could pass it. I'd been so focused on looking for proof that they didn't love me that I'd missed all the signs that they did. My aunt could see that I was struggling with this information. She asked if I was okay, and I almost told her everything right then. But I couldn't bring myself to confess the deception, especially knowing how much effort they'd all put into planning something special for me. The truth would have been devastating for everyone involved. Instead, I spent the rest of the barbecue watching my family with completely new eyes. I noticed how my brother kept checking on me, asking if I needed anything. I saw how my sister made sure to include me in conversations with her friends. I observed how my parents kept looking at me with relief and gratitude that I was healthy and there with them. All these behaviors that I dismissed as normal family interaction suddenly seemed like evidence of love. Maybe they'd always been there, and I'd just been too focused on what I wasn't getting to notice what I was getting. Maybe my test had been flawed from the beginning because I'd been looking for the wrong kind of proof. The drive home from that barbecue was one of the longest of my life. I kept thinking about all the assumptions I'd made, all the conclusions I'd drawn, all the distance I'd created based on incomplete information. I'd been so sure that I was unloved and invisible, but what if I'd been wrong about everything? When I got home, my uncle was waiting for me with takeout from my favorite restaurant. He could tell something had happened, And after some gentle prodding, I told him about my conversation with my aunt. He listened without judgment, then asked me a question that I'm still thinking about. He asked whether learning about their planned surprise changed how I felt about their individual responses. It was a good question. Did knowing about the secret plan excuse the fact that my brother had taken 3 days to respond to my text? Did it make my sister's distracted phone call more acceptable? Did it explain why my parents had focused on practical matters instead of emotional support? Or were those still valid concerns regardless of the bigger picture? I realized that both things could be true at the same time. My family could love me deeply while also being bad at showing it in the ways I needed. They could be planning something beautiful while also failing to provide immediate comfort. They could care about me while also being limited in their ability to express that care effectively. This nuanced understanding was harder to accept than the simple narrative I'd been telling myself. It was easier to believe they didn't love me than to accept that they loved me imperfectly. It was simpler to feel rejected than to navigate the complex reality of flawed but real relationships. My uncle and I talked about this for hours. He helped me see that most relationships exist in this gray area between perfect love and complete indifference. People do their best with the emotional tools they have, and sometimes that best isn't enough for what we need, but it's still meaningful and valuable. He also pointed out that my family's love language might be different from mine. While I needed immediate emotional support and presence, they might express love through actions and planning. While I wanted individual attention, they might show care through group efforts. We were all speaking different languages of love, and the miscommunication was causing everyone to feel misunderstood. This insight led to a gradual shift in how I approached my family relationships. Instead of expecting them to love me the way I wanted to be loved, I started looking for the ways they were already showing love in their own language. I began to appreciate my brother's practical offers of help, my sister's inclusion of me in her social circles, my parents' concern for my well-being and future. It wasn't the dramatic emotional connection I'd always craved, but it was real and consistent. They'd been showing up for me in their own way all along, and I'd been too focused on my own needs to notice their efforts. The fake illness experiment had taught me as much about my own expectations as it had about their limitations. The most important lesson from this whole experience was about the nature of love itself. Love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice, and it's complicated. It gets filtered through personality, past experiences, fear, and 1,000 other factors. The people who love us most might not always be able to show it in the ways we most need to see it. But that doesn't make their love less real or less valuable. It just makes it human. And maybe that's enough. Maybe instead of testing love to see if it meets our standards, we should be grateful for whatever love we receive and work to understand the forms it takes. Maybe the real test isn't whether people love us perfectly, but whether we can love them back despite their imperfections. My uncle was right from the beginning. Love isn't something you earn or deserve or prove. It's something you give and receive as best you can, with all the messiness and limitations that come with being human. The fake illness showed me that I was loved more than I realized, just not in the ways I'd been looking for. And sometimes that has to be enough.